All right. And welcome everyone to our current redistricting practices, how district maps impact your voice in government training. We are joined by some wonderful presenters tonight. First, we have David Andrews, who is a data analyst living in Concord. During the 2020 redistricting cycle, he worked at the Redistricting Data Hub, a national nonprofit assisting governments and organizations with redistricting data. He was the lead mapper for the Mapathon project, which created and introduced FAIR maps during the 2020 redistricting process in New Hampshire. Dave is also an expert witness in the City of Dover versus Scanlon case, which is challenging the New Hampshire House map that is currently in the New Hampshire Supreme Court. Then we're also joined by Samuel Davis, who is a clinical instructor in the election law clinic. He is a graduate of Duke University and Yale Law School. He clerked for Associate Justice Anita Earls of the Supreme Court of North Carolina. Prior to joining the clinic, Samuel litigated civil rights cases as a Lyman Fellow, I hope I pronounced that correctly, at the ACLU of North Carolina Legal Foundation, and was an associate at a plaintiff side workers' rights firm in Boston. Samuel is admitted to practice as an attorney in Massachusetts and North Carolina, and he lives in the Jamaica Plains area with his family. And before we get started, we're going to open with a land acknowledgement. Open Democracy acknowledges that we do our work on Endakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the people who have stewarded Endakina throughout the generations and continue to do so today. And then I will pass it on over to Sam to get started.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So as Autumn mentioned, I'm a clinical instructor at the Election Law Clinic at Harvard Law School. I litigate voting rights cases around the country and advocate on voting rights issues. And I'm really honored and grateful to be here today with you all. So just to start a quick overview, I'm sure most people have probably heard about redistricting, have some familiarity with the concept. But redistricting is the process of drawing the lines of districts from which public officials are elected. Redistricting is necessary because populations are not stable. So in the United States, there's a principle called one person, one vote, effectively, which means that everyone's vote should count equally. And to do that, you need to have districts that are comprised of roughly the same number of people, because if a district is much smaller, then people in that district will have much more voting power. Because populations change over time, people move, just transitions throughout the years, districts need to be redrawn. It's a normal process after each census. There's a process where all the lines are redrawn to ensure that there's equal voting populations in each district. That's a necessary and normal thing, but within that, there's a lot of discretion. And so when redistricting is done well, it can help ensure that there's fairness, that maps are drawn to not specifically advantage any group or disadvantaged groups, but unfortunately, redistricting is not always drawn just with fairness in mind. Can you go to, thank you. So there are two forms of gerrymandering, which is a term you've also probably heard that refers to efforts to use the redistricting process to advantage certain groups. And there's two forms of gerrymandering that we're going to cover tonight, partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. So partisan gerrymandering is what it sounds like. It's the practice of dividing a geographic area into electoral districts to give one political party an unfair advantage by diluting the opposition's voting strength. And I think this is, as it says here, typically the form of gerrymandering at issue in New Hampshire. But basically, in many states, redistricting is in the hands of political actors, whether that's the legislature or a commission appointed by the legislature, or in some places the governor has a say. But when there are many, many different ways that you could divvy up a state or a jurisdiction, and there are political actors in charge of drawing those lines. There's a temptation and an incentive to draw the lines in ways that advantage one's own political party. So what is an efficiency gap? This is a way of measuring whether a certain set of maps advantages one party over the other. And so, like it says, an efficiency gap is a metric used to measure partisan gerrymandering by calculating the disparity in wasted votes between political parties. So wasted votes are essentially votes that were unnecessary for the winning party to win, or votes cast for a losing party. And a kind of intuitive way to try and understand this is there are two ways in which map drawers can engage in gerrymandering. One way is by packing a lot of voters into a single district. So packing a lot of voters of a particular partisan valence into one district. So we have winner take all elections, right? And so you just need 50% plus one to win an election. If you draw a map in such a way as to put, let's say, all of the Democratic or all of the Republican voters in an area into one district so that they make up, 90% of that district, they're going to win in that district, but there's way more votes than necessary for them to win. So you're taking the voters out of other districts where their vote might matter and putting them into a district where it doesn't. The other way to engage in this kind of gerrymandering is cracking. It's to spread out voters into many, many districts so that they can never comprise a majority. So you take maybe a city where there's a lot of Democratic voters or a rural county where there's a lot of Republican voters, and you split it up so that the voters can't aggregate together to elect their candidate of choice. The efficiency gap is one way of measuring whether gerrymander has occurred. It's a relatively straightforward metric and has been articulated and advanced in many court cases, but there are also other metrics and other ways of looking at this. So what does the efficiency gap look like in New Hampshire? So as you can see here, and Dave can speak to this as well, the efficiency gap is nearly 15% for the Senate, 25% for the Executive Council, and 7% for the House. That is an overall number. You can see, though, that there are individual districts that have nearly 50% efficiency gaps in favor of Republicans. And what that means is it's not that the party who's advantaged by the partisan gerrymander is going to win every single election. It doesn't mean that the opposing party can never win. What it means, though, is that there's a systematic tilt in the races, so that for the party that is disadvantaged by the gerrymander, they have to do a lot more to win individual seats, and then way, way more to ever win a majority. And as Dave will discuss, this is among the worst partisan gerrymanders we see across the country.
Yeah, so jumping in here, this is a image of the Princeton gerrymandering project, and its grade of New Hampshire overall was given an F. And this is the Senate map specifically. If we jump to the next one, I can talk about the Executive Council and the Senate maps together. So if you look at the left, that's our Executive Council map. There's 5 seats. The gerrymander is pretty much a 4-seat Republican gerrymander versus 1-seat Democrat. And so you can see that what Sam talked about, the packing and the cracking. The district number 2 is the packed district. So what they did was they packed as many Democrats as possible into this district. And you can see with District 2 where it kind of it's kind of the Vermont border, but then it kind of reaches out and grabs different towns. And you can see it reaches out and it grabs Concord and Bow and Canterbury, highly packed Democrat towns. And then in Cheshire County, it reaches out and it grabs Keene, and then it reaches all the way out and grabs Peterborough, another kind of high density Democratic town. So it reaches out and grabs as many Democrats as possible and then packs them together. into that one district. And then in the other districts, it cracks the Democratic vote. So for District 1, it has like Dover and a little bit of the Seacoast, but then it counteracts that with adding in a lot of Republican votes in Belknap County and in Coos. And then it does kind of the same exact thing with some of the other ones. So for example, you can see Manchester is in there, which is Democratic leaning, but it counteracts that with some, Hillsborough and Merrimack, highly Republican towns in there. So the executive council map is kind of 4-1 when, New Hampshire's kind of like a 50-50 state. And then in the Senate map, it's kind of like a 16-8 Republican gerrymander. So there's kind of 8 seats where they pack Democrats in, which are 5, 10, 15, 4, 21, 24. What are the other ones? Oh, 12, and then 2 in Manchester as well, or 1 in Manchester. So the rest are, kind of favoring Republicans a little bit. There's at least some districts in this map which are kind of toss-up districts where you get like 9, 12, 18, where there's at least some, competitive, and they'll swing back and forth. But for a average election, you'll see kind of a 16-8 advantage for Republicans, and that's actually what we saw in the 24 election.
Actually, Autumn, if you could go back to the last slide just for a second, I want to maybe make 2 more quick points just to think about when you're thinking about gerrymandering. So one is really bizarrely drawn districts are often a sign that the map makers are engaged in some form of gerrymandering, but the districts themselves, like the shape, doesn't necessarily mean that maps are unfair. People are distributed throughout states in really different ways. And when map makers are drawing maps, there's a lot of different factors they're trying to consider. So one kind of very standard redistricting consideration is trying to keep communities of interest together. So for example, if there's a minority community that lives in a particular neighborhood of a city, trying to draw a map around that community to ensure that they can come together to elect the candidate of their choice. I was in North Carolina. There's a provision of the North Carolina Constitution that says counties should be kept together to the extent possible. That would give you a map that looks really clean, and the districts make sense, the lines make sense, but it would be wildly disproportionate because people aren't evenly distributed amongst the counties. So maps that look weird don't necessarily mean they're unrepresentative, but it can be raise suspicion that the map makers are trying to do something untoward. The other thing is that there are real trade-offs that map makers have to make in the redistricting process that can lead to results that seem really disproportionate or unfair, but maybe aren't indicative of a partisan gerrymander. So one of the trade-offs is there's a trade-off generally between representation at the kind of entity level. So if you take like the Senate, there's a trade-off between having the partisan representation in the Senate like mirror the voting population, and between creating competitive districts. So like if you drew, it's 24 districts, Senate districts, right? So if you drew 24 extremely competitive Senate districts where, it was about 50% Republicans, 50% Democrats in each district. In a wave election or a really good year for one party, you might have a party take all 24 seats. And so on some level, you would say those maps were really fair. It gave both parties a real opportunity to compete in every single district. But then you would say that the result was extremely unrepresentative because you'd have a 50-50 state where one party controlled. So there are real tensions in the redistricting process that don't necessarily reflect partisan malintent.
And I just want to add that if you look at the election results from 2024, about 50% of Democrats in the state voted for a Democratic candidate for executive council, and about 50% of the state voted for a candidate for a Republican state Senate candidate. But yet 1 Democrat is elected and 4 Republicans are elected. And so by that math, sort of you should have a more 2 to 3 split based on the sort of how people voted. But because of the way the lines were drawn, it does sort of tip in one way. And I think that the state Senate maps also tell a story too, where one party got 14 seats. One party got 16 seats, 16 seats, which is a super majority of the state, but they didn't get a super majority of the vote totals if you add up all the numbers of voters that voted for a Democratic candidate. And I think when you look at that, to me, the state Senate maps show that at least the math on the state Senate districts show a story of a much more partisan gerrymandered. And I'll just sort of say to Sam's point about sort of keeping communities of interest together. Senate District 7 is actually considered a very competitive Senate district, but it used to be the Lakes Region towns. All of them were Lakes Region towns. But now this map puts Franklin out of the Lakes Region area, splits the Lakes Region into like 2 districts or 3 districts, and puts Hillsborough and Orange, like towns that have nothing in common. And I think that it's really important for us to sort of also do some analysis on sort of those community of interest metrics. Towns that share school districts were often divided in some of these maps as well.
Great. Okay, and so the next form of gerrymandering here is racial gerrymandering, which again, like the name suggests, it's the political process or political practice of drawing voting districts in ways that dilute the voting power of racial minorities. And this is less common in New Hampshire because of the demographics of New Hampshire, but it's an issue in districts around the nation. And I'll say there are kind of two forms of racial gerrymandering, and that they map onto the packing and cracking that I described earlier. So one way is intentionally drawing districts so as to ensure that minority voters, often in this country, Black or Latino voters, are unable to comprise a working majority in any single district. So you see this a lot in the South, where Black communities are split amongst many districts to dilute their voting power. Another way of accomplishing this is to pack Black voters into a single district, right? Or pack Latino voters into a single district, so that whereas if you drew the lines in a different way, they might be able to get, let's say, 2 or 3 congressional seats. You pack them all into one district, and they're only able to elect one candidate. I think it's also just worth mentioning, both minority voters and white voters are able to bring racial gerrymandering claims. So under the US Supreme Court precedent, in a case called Shaw v. Reno, the court recognized that being sorted on the basis of race is a constitutional harm, whether or not it actually dilutes your voting power. So in that case, white voters who were put in a district, it did not dilute their voting power, but they claimed that intentionally being sorted, that was an expressive harm. And the court recognized that, and that puts states in a bind, as we'll talk about a little later, because complying with the mandates of federal law, including the Voting Rights Act, often requires states to district in ways that enhance the political power of historically marginalized groups. But then they do that, and that runs into this line of cases that says sorting voters by race is a racial gerrymander.
And can I just add that in New Hampshire, we see the most minority populations in Manchester and Nashua. And in those are the 2 largest cities in our state. And I think that it's also important to realize that the ward lines in big cities are drawn by the local government. So the Board of Aldermen in Manchester and the Board of Aldermen in Nashua are who drew the lines for those cities. And so sometimes we think about, oh, the state legislature draws the lines, but the local voting districts are drawn by the local body.
And those can be gerrymanders too, right? Many of my, the majority of my cases right now are at the municipal level challenging election systems that we allege dilute the voting power of minority communities. So this is a difficult slide to read, I'll acknowledge, but I think the main takeaway is that redistricting is contested everywhere across the country. There are definitely more claims you'll see in places where minority voters have historically been marginalized and where there are bigger minority populations, so across the South. But the problem of gerrymandering is not just restricted to any part of the country. It's not restricted to any one party. There are, if you'll notice the first column, which is partisan gerrymandering, there are claims in states that are historically controlled by the Republican Party, in states that are controlled by the Democratic Party. There are just real fights, to the extent that redistricting is in the hands of political actors. Political considerations will almost inevitably interact with the redistricting process and give rise to these kinds of claims. Yeah, so I'll just go through some of the highlights or lowlights of recent jurisprudence on the Voting Rights Act and redistricting. You're probably familiar with many of these cases, so I'll just try to describe them quickly, and if there are questions, I'm happy to dive into them. Shelby v. Holder is a case from 2013. This was really a shot across the bow kind of against the Voting Rights Act, which emerged out of the civil rights movement in the 60s. Shelby v. Holder held functionally held inoperative a provision of the Voting Rights Act called preclearance, which required certain jurisdictions with a history of discrimination in voting to essentially get approval from the Department of Justice before making changes to their voting systems. And the point of preclearance was to ensure that states were not, or localities were not implementing voter restrictions that would go backwards and diminish the voting power of minority groups. Since preclearance was struck down in 2013, you've seen states across the country implement voting practices and procedures that almost certainly would not have been approved prior to Shelby v. Holder. Rucho v. Common Cause. This was a case in 2019 that my colleagues here at the clinic in their old jobs actually litigated. This was an attempt to get the Supreme Court to hold that certain forms of partisan gerrymandering were unconstitutional under the federal Constitution. And I think it's notable this case arose out of Maryland and Wisconsin, so a state where Democrats were in charge and a state where Republicans in charge. Essentially, the court said, we think partisan gerrymandering is really bad. It interferes with the voting process and diminishes the fairness of elections, but there's no way for us to assess whether a partisan gerrymander is so bad that it violates the Constitution, and every state has authority to, has different considerations that are valid in the redistricting process. And so we as a federal court, we're just not going to get involved. You can try and bring these in state courts under state constitutions, but the federal Constitution is essentially silent on partisan gerrymandering. Brnovich v. DNC in 2021. This is a case addressing a different provision. So we've been talking mostly about vote dilution, which is drawing the line to diminish the voting power of a group. There's another line of cases under the Federal Voting Rights Act that involves vote denial or vote suppression. These are things like voter ID requirements or closing polling locations, things that interfere with an individual's ability to exercise their right to vote. Brnovich was the first Supreme Court case to consider vote denial claims under Section 2. And what it essentially did was make it much harder to bring these claims. It articulated a set of guideposts that were supposed to guide whether courts should find that vote denial rose to the level of a VRA violation. That those guideposts included things like the magnitude of the burden, and magnitude not in the sense of did this disparately impact racial or ethnic minority group, but literally are a lot of people unable to vote because of this, and whether a practice was utilized when the VRA was reauthorized in 1986. So essentially, if something was common practice in 1986, it is permissible today, even though the world has changed a lot since 1986. I guess in brighter news, Allen v. Milligan was a case in 2023. This was focused on the vote dilution provision of the Voting Rights Act. The state, so this was a case out of Alabama. Alabama was essentially arguing that any effort to remedy vote dilution was necessarily a form of race discrimination because it required states to consider race in the redistricting process. That functionally would have made vote dilution impossible to remedy because there's no way to remedy vote dilution if you don't account for the race of the voters. That's kind of the whole point. Allen v. Milligan, I think surprisingly to most people in the voting rights community, rejected that argument and said, at least as it has historically been utilized, Section 2 still prohibits vote dilution and still permits states to consider race when remedying dilutive maps. And then Alexander, which also came out in 2023, this addressed the interaction between racial gerrymandering and partisan gerrymandering claims. So you'll remember the court in 2019 said partisan gerrymandering doesn't offend the federal constitution. So in cases where states are accused of racial gerrymandering, they'll also often say, no, we're not doing this for racial reasons. We're doing this for partisan reasons. That's like analytically not really a clean distinction because in this country, and especially in the South, race and partisanship are really intertwined, and discerning whether a legislator was considering race or partisanship in drawing a particular map can be really difficult. The basic takeaway from Alexander, which is a case out of South Carolina, is that absent really direct evidence of intent to sort voters by race, courts are going to presume that if a legislature says it was doing something for partisan reasons, that's a plausible justification. I think I'll finish with just a reminder that the U.S. Supreme Court is not the only court in the game when it comes to redistricting. So every state has its own state court system. Every state has its own state constitutions. Many of those constitutions have provisions that are not found anywhere in the U.S. Constitution, or which are far more expansive than analogous provisions in the U.S. Constitution. So in Pennsylvania, for example, there's a free and fair elections clause. The state courts there have interpreted that to prohibit most forms of partisan gerrymandering. There's been similar decisions in North Carolina, although that was then reversed, and in other states. There's also been a movement to try and enact state-level voting rights acts. These are state laws which both codify the protections of the Federal Voting Rights Act. So in the event that the U.S. Supreme Court keeps chipping away at the Federal Voting Rights Act, there'd be a state-level analog, but then also expand on what the federal VRA does to provide broader protections to voters in states that are adapted to the conditions that particular communities face on the ground in those states. So I think as of now, there are 8 states that have enacted state VRAs, and one is currently pending in Colorado. So that's been an exciting frontier to try and move forward in the face of a very hostile federal judicial system.
So looking at the courts here in New Hampshire, there was kind of two main lawsuits filed after the 2020 redistricting cycle. The first was Miles Brown v. the Secretary of State. This was kind of in the same vein of Rucho v. Common Cause, which was trying to say that that partisan gerrymandering violated the federal constitution. This was in the same way, saying that partisan gerrymandering violated the New Hampshire Constitution. It aimed to overturn both the New Hampshire Executive Council and the New Hampshire Senate maps, but unfortunately lost in the New Hampshire Supreme Court with a 3-2 decision. The other challenge was the City of Dover v. Scanlon. This was challenging the New Hampshire House map, and it argued that the lack of dedicated districts violated Part 2, Article 11 of the New Hampshire districts, which essentially says that if a town is large enough to have its own representative, it should be given that. And it initially lost in the Stratford County Superior Court and then was appealed to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And then arguments were just heard about a month ago, and we are still waiting a decision on that, which could take a few months here.
And I'll just add that in the City of Dover case, our New Hampshire Constitution says cities with large enough population shall have a dedicated district. And that is a big distinction that is required by the state constitution, that they keep towns together. And what happened in Dover is they took one ward and merged it with surrounding towns. So they didn't keep the City of Dover together. They didn't keep the City of Rochester together, and many other places where communities that are supposed to have their own dedicated state district. So David, tell us how many constitutional violations were in the map that was passed by the House.
I believe there was 62, and the Mapathon maps were 44. So there was like 14 extra violations in the enacted maps versus the maps that the Mapathon project put together, which I can talk about on the next slide. So the Mapathon Citizen Mapping Project was a kind of a collaboration with Granite State Progress, League of Women Voters, Open Democracy, and Kent Street Coalition. And it aimed to emulate what a fair, nonpartisan redistricting commission could look like. And so what we did was we first went out, asked the voters, what criteria would you like to see used in creating these maps? So once you get past the federal requirements and the state requirements, communities of interest, which communities of interest are most important to you? Should we be following county lines? What was most important to the, New Hampshire residents we talked to? So we went through that, created criteria. We then created maps based on that criteria, multiple different maps. Again, presented them back to, New Hampshire residents. And then they kind of voted on which maps they thought kept to the criteria in the best ways. We then submitted those maps to the legislature. We testified on those maps. We held trainings to get other Granite Staters to testify on those maps. And then we analyzed the maps that were proposed by, both the Democrats and Republicans in the state legislature. Sure. We had over 250 people participate. We had, tons and tons of people testify in front of the legislature, and, everyone who all the legislators who were on the redistricting commissions knew who Mapathon was. They talked about Mapathon. They talked about our maps. So we definitely had an impact into the redistricting process. It didn't go exactly the way we wanted it to, but they at least, heard us when in, 2010, it was more of a backroom dealings and the maps came out and there was not a lot of public testimony or anything like that. We at least kind of put it front and center of New Hampshire and at least made them, explain, what they were doing.
And also part of the Mapathon project, many people went to town meeting and got town meeting resolutions. About 74 towns across the state called on the state legislature using town meeting to ask for a fair, nonpartisan map. But so that was another tactic that was used in conjunction with this project. We want to talk about solutions. So one of the solutions that we can have, Autumn, if you want to go to the next slide, is an independent redistricting commission. Representative Connie Lang will sponsor this in 2026. This is a bipartisan way for us to ensure equal representative for fair maps ahead of the 2030 drawing of maps. This would require transparencies in all meetings open to the public and a hearing in each county. This also, the proposed legislation would put retired judges as selecting the commissioners. So this is one solution that we will see next year in the New Hampshire legislature to create fair maps for the next time we have a redistricting process. And we call it an independent redistricting commission because it's independent of the legislature, but it's also advisory. So it would give advice to the legislature of a map to draw, and the legislature would have to vote up or down on those maps. Another redistricting bill is CACR 2, which I believe has not come up for a public hearing yet. So we should see this in the House election law soon. This is Representative Heath Howard who's proposed this bill. This would amend the New Hampshire Constitution so that it would say no district boundary shall be drawn. That should say in a way that favors or disfavors any political party or a candidate. So this is basically putting into our Constitution that we cannot have partisan gerrymandering. And also Representative Connie Lang has House Bill 363, which establishes redistricting criteria. So the things that we talked about earlier as communities of interest, keeping towns together, would all be in law as part of the criteria used in drawing maps. This also has not come up for a public hearing. And I would say that maybe these bills could be next Tuesday or the following Tuesday. Normally the hearings happen in February because they have to get all of the bills through the House committees by March. So we should see public hearings on these two bills shortly, and we'll make sure to let all of you know about this and ways that you can support fair redistricting going forward. So we can take the slideshow down and we've covered a lot of ground, but if anyone wants to ask a question, you can either raise your hand and ask a question, or we can start with Sarah's question in the, if there are any redistricting efforts organized by conservative groups. So if somebody wants to take that on. What I know about conservative groups is it's something called the Project Red Map. And Dave Daly writes about it in his book. And I think it's the Project Red Map. Most of the data we've seen about that is in 2010. But I have a feeling no one's done as much analysis, but I think that efforts happened again. And there is another Republican redistricting initiative that Scott Brown, former governor of Wisconsin, is involved in too, right? About gerrymandering?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I can say is both parties engage in partisan gerrymandering. So like a interesting, or maybe something that is reflective of this, I think most people understand or feel that in most states, most individual states, the maps aren't fair, right? That the party in power draws those maps in a way to benefit their own partisan interests. And there are some states that have independent redistricting commissions, some states where state courts have enforced constitutional limitations on partisan gerrymandering. But in a lot of places, whether that's in New Hampshire or in New York or North Carolina, where I practiced previously, one party, the party in power draws maps to benefit its own interests. But when you aggregate all of that up, if you look at the House of Representatives currently, even if the underlying state races and the underlying state maps are partisan gerrymanders, the net result is at the House level, the distribution of power pretty much precisely mirrors the kind of popular vote across the state and across the country, and mirrors the partisan distribution of voters in the last election. And so it's kind of a problem where neither party has much of an incentive in unilaterally disarming, while the other party is still going to engage in partisan gerrymandering. And that's why there was such a push to find a federal constitutional right to this, or a federal constitutional prohibition on partisan gerrymandering, because that would have bound parties in every state, right? But absent that, you're likely to see continued partisan gerrymandering wherever it's possible.
Additional questions or comments or thoughts? Amy, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I'm just wondering like how much the general public really knows about this. We're all here to learn about it in this small of a group. Is it because it is both Republican and Democrat? Is there any, nonpartisan group who pushes this forward and says this isn't good for our country, and let the general population know that this is something that they should be pushing their representatives to change?
I don't know, Olivia, if you want to speak to New Hampshire.
Go ahead.
I mean, the short answer is yes. I think there are a lot of nonpartisan groups that are dedicated to combating gerrymandering. And I think a feature of partisan gerrymandering, I think in some ways, like racial vote dilution can be kind of hard to explain, because it's about, how you draw the lines, which enables communities to aggregate together to elect their candidates of choice. And it can feel very technical sometimes. I think partisan gerrymandering is like really offensive to people. I mean, and not that racial gerrymandering isn't, but in a way that people really resonate. Like partisan gerrymandering, you have political parties drawing the maps to benefit themselves. Like I think that has been a really powerful and compelling message. And I think you've seen in some states, including in some places where there were really entrenched partisan gerrymanders, you saw people either adopt independent redistricting commissions by citizens petition. You saw in Florida, there was a state constitutional amendment to require partisan fairness in maps. The problem is parties were deeply entrenched interest in engaging in partisan gerrymandering. So in Ohio, essentially it's very convoluted, but the state Republicans basically ignored the results, functionally nullified what the Independent Redistricting Commission had recommended. In Florida, you have courts not enforcing the Partisan Fairness Amendment. So it's a really thorny problem that persists even when there's been organizing around it.
I'll just say in New Hampshire in 2010, there were 2 people who like testified at the State House on the maps. It was Caitlin Rollo and one other person. And I think that when we look at the 200 people who showed up to testify on the maps, you know, a decade later, to me, that's like a lot more citizen engagement with the process. So, do I still think we have work to do to educate other folks about what is gerrymandering and why is it a problem in New Hampshire and what we can do about it? Absolutely. I mean, I think we need to have conversations in every library across the state and keep writing letters to the editor and keep sort of doing as much organizing as we can. And even like at town meeting coming up in Merrimack, there is a petition warrant article around partisan gerrymandering and going into voting districts. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done to sort of bring more awareness, but I do think that the general public awareness has grown in the last decade. But I think there's still work to do. David, do you want to say more about New Hampshire too?
Yeah, so I think one big problem, there's a few problems. One is that it's only every 10 years really that it like comes into the limelight and it has its kind of day. So it's really difficult to, you know, continually engage in something where it's like we can keep trying to, you know, pass amendments on all this stuff, but really redistricting only happens once every 10 years. So, you know, we'll see a lot more, you know, big pushes going into 2030 to engage the public and inform the public on, you know, partial gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering, but it's difficult when it's kind of spread out so much. The other thing is that it can be very technical in that, you know, there's a lot of math, so it can be a little difficult to explain, you know, exactly why a map is unfair. So like what, you know, Sam was saying earlier, where it's like, you know, it's not necessarily the funkiness of the district shapes. That's just a way of kind of people trying to explain it in a way that's very easily understandable, where it's like, you know, you see District 9, the Senate district in New Hampshire, which goes from Hinsdale all the way to Bedford, and it's like one straight line, one, you know, people can understand. They're like, that looks funky. Like, what does Bedford have to do with Hinsdale? But like, if you go into the math and be like, well, there's, you know, they packed that district and crack that district with 47% and 93%, you know, like it gets very technical and it's hard to explain. So there's a couple different kind of difficulties in explaining, you know, gerrymandering to the public and have them kind of really grasp it and understand why it's so important that we have fair districts drawn.
Yeah. So Amy also asked if there's one group so in New Hampshire, we call ourselves the Fair Map Coalition, which is made up of the League of Women Voters and Open Democracy and America Votes and several other groups that are involved. 603 Forward was involved. So we were really operating in a very much of a coalition in the state. And I would say at the national level that there are lots of groups like that are probably representative of many of the members of our coalition, like the League of Women Voters and Common Cause and others that work on educating the public and organizing around this. But I don't know, Sam, there's also kind of institutions like SAM at Harvard, but also the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. I think Tufts has another gerrymander. So there are some other groups in academia that are helping us advocates with the analysis that is needed to educate folks. So Sam, if you want to say anything more about like.
Yeah, I think it's runs the gamut in terms of ways in which to support advocacy efforts. So Olivia mentioned the Tufts group and the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, which are doing the quantitative analyses to understand the magnitude of gerrymandering in particular places and trying to translate that in ways that are accessible to the public and to courts. There are groups like League of Women's Voters, Common Cause. There's a group, All on the Line, that advocate in their own communities and across the country to make either legislative change or kind of political change. And then there are groups that litigate these questions. We're a very small organization that litigates gerrymandering claims, but groups like the ACLU, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, they have attorneys dedicated to trying to combat partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering, and they're nonpartisan. Obviously, the voters they represent may have partisan preferences, but those organizations are also nonpartisan.
I saw Phil come on camera. Did you have a question?
Yeah, the chair of the New Hampshire House Election Law Committee likes to cite Michigan when he argues against having independent commissions. He talks about them ending up in federal court. Can you shed any light on what actually happened there?
So I'm not actually familiar with the Michigan example, but I think like conceptually, independent redistricting commissions can be really appealing as a way to try and take politics out of the map drawing process. And like, if I can imagine why you'd rather have an independent commission drawing the maps than the like legislators who will then be running in those elections. The problem is it's actually really hard to take politics out of the map drawing process, including when there's an independent commission. So on an independent commission, there's a basic question of who is going to comprise that commission and how are those people going to be appointed. There's then questions about what standards they'll use to assess which maps should be put in place. So like I mentioned, states have different considerations, things like community of interest or contiguity that inform the redistricting process. Often there are a lot of different acceptable, permissible options. There's a range of potential maps that a commission could adopt. How should it choose which of the maps to adopt? There could be partisan gerrymandering that's very subtle, right? That doesn't massively tilt the playing field, but ensures that one party has a durable, better shot to maintain power over time. So I think the answer, generally is independent commissions can be great, but it's also important to have enforceable standards and oversight. So in places where there's independent commissions and there's also kind of judicial standards that can be enforced to ensure that commissions exercise their discretion within boundaries that prohibit extreme partisan gerrymandering. I think that's kind of the gold standard.
But I think that Michigan's not the only state that has an independent redistricting commission that maps were challenged in court. And I think that to the specific question you asked, remember the actor who is citing this. I think he's deflecting. I just, in my mind, I see the map that he drew as a member of the Special Committee on Redistricting. It was a really bad partisan gerrymandered map. And so I think, New Hampshire is different than Michigan. Michigan has a citizen referendum where citizens actually put the Independent Redistricting Commission in front of voters, and voters overwhelmingly voted for it. So I think, it's important to say that there are different ways where, other states have gotten to these solutions. And just because a map went to court doesn't mean the process is flawed. So
every map goes to court, basically. Whether it's drawn by a independent commission or the legislature, there's a lot at stake. And in addition to all of the nonpartisan groups that we talked about earlier, the political parties obviously have a huge interest in how these fights play out. And so the political parties are huge actors here in terms of litigating these disputes. So the fact that it went to court is not a reason to throw out the whole model.
Yeah, David, did you want to add anything more about that, since you've had many conversations with
Yeah. So I think the Michigan challenge was actually the legality of the independent commission, not so much the maps themselves. I believe it was like based on the US Constitution saying that legislatures have the prerogative to, you know, redraw the maps. They were challenging the independent commission in that vein. Not that they were just
Yeah.
like bad
And
maps.
that has been a theory that the U.S. Constitution delegates authority to state legislatures to administer federal elections. So at least with respect to congressional districts, the theory is that only the legislature and the legislature alone is authorized to do redistricting. That was rejected in a case out of Arizona, I think in 2015. That essentially said the federal constitution does not prohibit independent commissions because they're still exercising legislative power. But that was a 5-4 decision, and so I think you'll probably see those kinds of challenges continue to swirl given how the court has shifted since 2015.
Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and we understand that it takes all of us to create change that we want to see in this world. And so we have some time to advocate, to educate, and to mobilize. And then also Autumn will send out the slides and the recording for tonight's presentation. And also, if you have questions or thoughts or something tonight sparked your idea of writing a letter to the editor or taking action, we encourage that, and we are here as a resource to help. So thank you all so much and have a wonderful night. Stay warm.